Welcome to part 19 of Woe to America, Woe to the Nations, Woe to Babylon. And this here is August the 12th, 2024 by man's calendar, and also what man says is the 9th of Av. Continuing through this evening, we shall see if God proves it out that it's the 9th of Av or not, if God shows out. If God shows out, it's going to be a worldwide show out. It's not going to just be something localized. God does things spectacularly. Yes, He will address us individually, but if it's a show out moment like the 9th of Av, He's going to show out globally. It ain't going to be just poof, localized. Now, getting back into this video, it's discussing the Trumpinator and his parents. Currently, it's telling you about his dad and how he got his start.
Fred bought them low, sold them high, and made enough money to turn E. Trump & Son into one of New York's biggest real estate companies. He passed his success on to his children. Donald and his siblings grew up in a house that had 23 rooms, and the family chauffeur drove them to school every morning. Fred also passed on his ruthless streak. Throughout Donald's childhood, his father always gave him the same advice: work hard, don't be weak, be a killer. Donald took it to heart. He bullied his classmates. He even bullied his younger brother. One day, he threw an eraser at his teacher.
He bullied his way through. Sound like Jesus to you? Come on, people. How hard is this for you to understand? Bullying somebody to get your way is not what Jesus does. It's not what He did. But He's about to. He's about to keep His word to send His wrath.
Immediately took action and sent Donald to a military boarding school upstate. It was a tough, competitive environment, but surprisingly for a rich kid, Donald...
This is what Fred did because of Donald's bullying. He sent him to a military camp, or at least that's what they would like us to believe, that's why. But it was always because he was supposed to be raised with military upbringing.
Thrived. He excelled at several sports and was named captain his senior year. In the yearbook, he was named Ladies' Man. Years later, Donald would credit his time at boarding school with teaching him the discipline he needed to succeed in business and politics. But he knew that discipline by itself wasn't enough. So he went to college, 2 years at Fordham University before a transfer to the University of Pennsylvania's business school. After graduating in 1968, Donald Trump joined his father's company. The first few years weren't glamorous. Donald and Fred had to roll up their sleeves and turn around some housing projects which were losing money. For Donald, it was an early lesson. Just because he'd been given lots of advantages, he still needed to work for his success. After a 3-year apprenticeship, Donald became president of the company. The torch had been passed from father to son. One of his first moves was to rebrand. E. Trump & Sons sounded stale and old-fashioned. A modern real estate business, led by a dynamic young entrepreneur, needed a glamorous name. So Trump rebranded it to the Trump Organization. It was an early step in the evolution from Donald to Trump.
Imagine making $453,000.
Sorry about the commercial.
Trump moved into an Upper East Side apartment and started going to some of Manhattan's elite nightclubs, usually with a beautiful woman on his arm. It didn't look like it to most people, but Trump was working. He was marketing his most important commodity, himself. It was right around this time that he made his debut in another high-profile local institution, the New York Times. The Times embodied the elite establishment that, decades later, Trump would build a political career upon opposing. But in the early 1970s, he was anxious for their attention and approval. The first time the New York Times mentioned Donald Trump, it wasn't for a good reason. The headline said it all. Major landlord accused of anti-black bias in city. The story concerned a Department of Justice lawsuit filed against Donald Trump and his father, which alleged that the Trump Organization discriminated against African Americans. Even for someone who believed all publicity was good publicity, it was tough reading. Most of the lawyers Trump talked to urged him to settle, but that just wasn't who he was. Trump met Roy Cohn at a swanky Manhattan nightclub in the early 1970s. Trump was complaining to anyone who'd listen that he couldn't find a lawyer who believed he could win the discrimination lawsuit. Cohn offered his services. He filed a $100 million countersuit against the Department of Justice. Although it was unsuccessful, the final settlement ultimately allowed the Trump Organization to get away without admitting any wrongdoing. It was a win for Trump, and a lesson he'd carry with him for the rest of his life. Never admit your mistakes. Roy Cohn was Donald Trump's lawyer for 15 years.
Never admit your mistakes. Did you catch that? Yet the Bible teaches us to confess our faults. If you do not come to the Lord repenting and confessing your faults, you're not going to get anywhere with the Lord. You can't just cover up the evils you're doing. There is nothing hidden that shall not be revealed.
This is a picture of Donald and me in which he says, Roy is my greatest friend.
Now remember, you think a man's going to save you. And I'm so glad this freezed on that particular spot. I want you to look at Babylon. See it yet? See all those great towers stretching up into the air? Thinking they could build better than God? And that they could outdo God? It's their name on those products, not the Lord's. Do you see the tower on top of the tower? Why do you think that's there? It's a high pinnacle. And it has its purposes.
Trump soon set his sights on something that could make his career. The old Penn Central Railroad had gone broke a few years earlier and left behind 3 prime real estate assets, the Commodore Hotel and 2 rail yards on New York's west side. The rail yards were the largest undeveloped tracts of land left in Manhattan. If Trump could get his hands on those assets, he'd prove to everyone, including his father, that he could succeed as a developer in his own right. He knew that if he played his cards right, he had a chance. He wined and dined the development agency's lead official. He held press conferences where he outlined his vision for the site. And thanks to his father's political connections, he met face-to-face with the mayor. After pulling strings for weeks, Trump got what he wanted, the right to develop the sites. Trump turned the Commodore into the Grand Hyatt.
The Grand Hyatt held its grand opening today.
Probably the most successful hotel, one of them in the country, we feel.
He knew that just winning the development rights wasn't enough. It wasn't going to silence his critics, who said he was only in that position because of his father's money and connections. And it wasn't enough to satisfy his own ambitions. If he truly wanted to be the king of New York real estate, he had to build.
The
and not just anything, something
New York
big.
real
So
estate.
Trump swung for the fences. He promised to build 20,000 apartments on the site, more than his father had built in his entire career.
He was building a name for himself. Not for Jesus, for himself. He's coming in his own name.
Along from 72nd all the way down to 59th, we're going to have magnificent marinas, shopping, restaurants, everything all over the Hudson River.
The local community hated the idea. They thought the proposal just didn't fit with the character of the neighborhood, and they were politically influential enough to block the development. Trump raged. But there wasn't much he could do. Full-scale attack wouldn't work. The situation required deft diplomacy that Trump just didn't have in his toolkit. So when the option came up in 1979, he had no choice but to let it lapse. It was the biggest and most bitter disappointment of his career to date. But in Trump's mind, defeat was only ever temporary. So he made a vow that next time he wouldn't let it slip out of his grasp. In the meantime, he had other things occupying his mind.
I'm going to show you a way to potentially make money.
Other things occupying his mind.
Keep your eye on Babylon.
Ivana Marie Zelnikova was a tall, striking blonde with an exotic backstory. A competitive skier and child actor, she married a childhood friend so she could use his Austrian citizenship to escape the Eastern Bloc. After they divorced, she moved to Canada, where she met Trump. A few months after they started dating, they got married at a church on Fifth Avenue on April 9th, 1977. Their first son, Don Jr., was born about 9 months later. Fifth Avenue wasn't just home to the church where Donald Trump got married. He also wanted it to be the new headquarters of the Trump Organization. Trump had dreamed of building a tower on Fifth Avenue since he was a kid. To him, it represented the peak of glamour and power. The site he wanted was occupied by a luxury department store. In order to press his case, he kept calling and calling the parent company asking if they were interested in selling the site. They thought he was joking. But he was serious, and he wasn't going to give up. Finally, after a couple years, the parent company's new chairman, who was looking to pay down some debts, said yes.
Bonwitz is being sold to Donald Trump.
Trump secured the site, but that was only half the battle. He still had to persuade the approval committee, which was made up of the same sorts of people who'd blocked his plans for the rail yards just a couple years earlier. Trump needed a different approach. So this time, instead of aggression, he pointed to the fact that reputable architects liked his plan design. Not everyone was persuaded. The media class hated it. The construction of Trump Tower marked another big step in the journey from Donald to Trump.
This is the greatest skyline in the world, so this is a great addition to New York
Sorry
skyline.
about the interruptions.
Of the tallest concrete building.
And it marked the beginning of what would prove to be a highly successful decade.
Highly
Welcome to the
successful.
80s. Ronald Reagan, the next president of the United States.
Introducing the Macintosh.
We have a new formula for Coke. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life.
I Diana Crosses, take me in it, Charles Buffalo.
The murder of John Lennon, one of the most influential people of his time.
Gorbachev tear down this wall.
The 1980s were
yeah.
tailor-made for Donald Trump.
See Babylon
Greed was
Rising?
good, and Ronald Reagan proved you didn't need to be a career politician to become president. Only in the 1980s could Trump go from being a real estate developer to a national celebrity who bridged the worlds of finance, entertainment, and politics.
Well, there's a lot of coverage in that.
The newspapers and magazines which had made fun of him were forced to cover his rise. He became a frequent guest on talk shows, whose hosts liked his charisma and his willingness to talk about all sorts of topics. Opening it.
Hello, they own the media. All this was planned. All this was planned to make you think that he was a rising star. It wasn't about that they hated him. That was the way it was fun to look. So he could look like the underdog coming up, like he was for you. To win your hearts, so you would wash up the beast when it was time. I keep telling you, do not wash up mankind. Wash up Jesus, and only Jesus.
Casino added to Trump's opulent glamour. To many Americans, Trump, who had a tower with his name on it and a glamorous European wife, embodied the 1980s hyper...
The Tower of Babylon, with his name on it. One of the tallest towers in the United States. And y'all still don't see it. You haven't seen it. because you weren't looking for Jesus. You wanted to be like that man, successful, and with lots of wealth. I'll see you in the next part.